people really agreed on this idea of civic duty, of just public responsibility based on the aesthetics of the swatches that were unanimously agreed upon as positive.
Hi, I'm here with Joseph Fioramonti again, the CEO of Constellations, and today we're just going to go over our most recent audience perception mapping test, which was what does American look like in light of the 4th? We wanted to run this one. Going into this, what were you hoping to learn from asking this question?
Yeah, I just thought it'd be kind of a fun one for the holiday. What does American look like to you? And so we're still kind of early stages, so smaller audiences, but we were able to get about 50 respondents and was just hoping to gain some clarity about the things we all agree on around the holiday about what American looks like to people.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenges you may have faced with this test specifically?
So I made a video just using it as an opportunity to demonstrate how to create an APM within the system, and I approached it kind of casually and quickly picked things that jumped out to me. There was less planning than I would typically do if I was, working on a rebrand or doing a bigger study for commercial purposes or academic purposes, whatever. And so when we ran the test, the results came back. It was really hard to discern what the differences were between the positive results and the negative results. And I think the challenge was one, probably a little bit less due diligence on my end in terms of curating the images and really thinking about what were we trying to figure out. Just kind of a fun one. Um, but that led to a few kind of realizations. Even though they were hard to interpret at first, it was still useful. Like if I had been approaching a brand or a campaign for the holiday, even though it was harder to get to the why, there were still clear patterns and things that would have been usable for a campaign, even though they would have been a little blurry about what the mechanics, what the associations were underneath the why. So that was kind of an important realization through doing this one. And then new techniques. I hadn't done this before, but I exported the positive and the negative boards and I put them into Chat GPT and asked it to find patterns and differences between them. And it was actually able to kind of point out a few things that I was having a hard time seeing. So that was a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, definitely, which was really awesome because I know like when we look at these tests sometimes it's hard to figure out those patterns, but after doing that it was like, oh, that is pretty clear, or it just helps us move in the right direction with what we're looking at.
Right. Yeah. I mean, AI is so good at pattern recognition. That's what it does. And I had my designer filter on. I was looking at colors and design elements, and it was able to see thematics that I should have been able to see. And once it pointed it out, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, it was a really helpful kind of way to use the tool that I hadn't done before.
Yeah, can we actually pull up the test to speak about those results?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the results screen, and I'll just go through kind of what the three APMs that we created were. Turn down the dot transparency a little bit. So typical red, white, and blue stuff. And if I were to do it again, I'd probably be a little bit more intentional about having more diversity within the initial choices to get a little bit more kind of variety in terms of the design elements. It was a lot of red, white, and blue. It was a lot of kind of these sepia toned, more mid 19th century kind of type and print motifs. And in the positive and negative results, if we turn this up to 75%, you can see it's kind of exactly what I put into it. A lot of black and white, a lot of kind of aged paper tones, a lot of mid 19th century type. And the positive and the negatives weren't all that different in terms of design elements. You're still getting a lot of red, white, and blue, stars and stripes, everything you'd expect to be associated with American. And the themes that Chat pointed out, and rightly so, was that the positive board, thematically at least, seemed to point much more towards this idea of civic duty. A lot of mid 20th century stuff. This is probably a student piece or something like that, but it's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But you can see this gentleman in a very kind of 1950s outfit walking upstairs like the American flag. Martin Luther King, John F. John F. Kennedy, but even these items that ranked really really high. This stamp right here, I tend to think of the Postal Service as like this American civic duty thing. There's a lot of kind of government kind of overlay there, and just these aspects of civic life that are in here. But if you look at the negative, it's pretty corporate. Even these older things are still Liberty Warehouse is trying to sell me something. These stars and stripes feel a little bit more markety, perhaps. These patterns, uh, even this really kind of mid 19th century type thing, it's got a little bit of distress to it. It's still trying to sell me something, and so that was what it pointed out that was interesting, and that I had a hard time seeing with my graphic designer lenses on, and just looking at design elements themselves.
Yeah, can we also talk a little bit about the neutral?
Yeah, that was an interesting thing as well. Is that the neutral were considerably different, and to my design eye even, than the positive and the negative. It seemed to be more of a mix of commercial and everyday life sports things, more traditional sports things, older football shot here, Jackie Robinson and this hope text at the top. It would have been really interesting to kind of segment our audience a little bit more, which would be hard to do at this stage. But it was these things that were mixed opinions, right? These are the things that Americans, in our audience had a different opinion about, and didn't agree upon. And I thought that was really interesting. And, as the tool grows and progresses and we add more features and we add more just aspects of context that we can parse out, geographic location, socioeconomic status, these kinds of things will add a lot of interesting context to help us better understand how things are perceived by different groups of people, different kinds of people, different walks of life, different political persuasions, and why they chose what they chose and how they feel about things.
So, just to like recap, what do you think were the biggest takeaways from this test? I know the positive and the negative visually look pretty similar, but even if it's not the difference in what they are visually, I know you talked about like you can still move in the direction because you know what looks good.
Yeah, so I mean, the two big takeaways for me were that, even if you don't have a very clear thing that you can take away as far as design elements go, and just knowing why people are responding the way that they are. We did that report on what does visual data look like, and there were some very clear takeaways for a broad audience that were pretty powerful, I feel. But even if you don't get that clear answer, you still have actionable data. You have these collages, and you are able to lean in on the things that you see in them and lean away from the things in the negative. So you don't always need a really good rational why behind the answers you get. You still have answers, and you know that people kind of gravitate towards certain things, and you can run with that. So that's powerful in and of itself. But it was also just more zooming out. I'm not going to ignore the fact that it's a politically challenging time for everybody. There's a lot of division right now during this particular Fourth of July season. And it was interesting to look at the positives and see that our audience, which is, small but diverse, people really agreed on this idea of civic duty, of just public responsibility based on the aesthetics of the swatches that were unanimously agreed upon as positive, and that the corporate stuff didn't feel American. And that, I think, is, a really good thing and a really powerful thing. It was encouraging to see that.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit about how you're saying, like, even if you verbally can't express like the why, you have these visuals that are clear. And I think that's important for the tool in general because a lot of the time when we are doing rebrands or we're talking to clients, like words are vague and sometimes we don't know exactly what we're communicating to each other. And that's where there's confusion or there might not be alignment. But like with these visuals, even if you can't express with your words what exactly you mean, you can physically see it, and I think that will help people in general like move in the right direction because it's actually visible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something just more intuitive about putting a collection of images together and seeing those patterns on both ends of the test, right? When somebody is asked, "What does American look like to you?" I could try to describe it in words, but I'm not going to capture the nuance of the colors, the typographic treatments, the patterns, the textures, these things. It would be very hard to articulate that. And even if I did, on the other end, somebody understanding exactly what is in my head would be virtually impossible. But this tool lets you do that, and in such a quick, easy way. It really only takes about 2, 3 minutes for somebody to go through and do one of these tests. And then on the other side, just kind of seeing that nuance and understanding it and seeing the patterns of this civic duty thing. Like that wasn't part of the question. It was a really simple question. What does American look like to you? But we get rich answers from those simple questions. And I think that's really important.
This leads a little bit into my next question. Before I frame that, when we first had talked about this test, in my head, I wasn't necessarily thinking like graphic design perspective. I was just thinking like, what do Americans associate with like the fourth and in America with America in general? So before you had curated this, I was thinking more images of like hot dogs, fireworks, like what were people going to say they associated the most with like the holiday or the spirit. And then once you actually created the test, I was like, oh, that's not the direction we were going in. I would be curious to see what that would look like maybe next year, for more like just a general like public, what do people associate with the holiday kind of test, versus like graphic design specific. But going with that, like there are so many use cases for this platform. You can really tailor it to what you need. So obviously this was more geared towards like design elements of that American word. So I guess my next question would be, is there anything that you would change about how we framed or presented the question? Because just like you said, like we didn't even talk about civil duty or civic duty, but that kind of came across.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's a great question. It kind of uncovers the collaborative nature of making a test. Probably didn't handle this great, to be honest. I sat down and I just kind of picked things that I liked, and there's, I think, value in that. I think, there's some good takeaways that we've already discussed. But if you and I had sat down and kind of collaborated and we were trying to figure out, you know, more Fourth of July celebratory stuff, hamburgers, hot dogs, that kind of stuff, fireworks, that would have been interesting to see too, and added a layer to this that in the context of that time as well. Like we're asking this around the 4th of July. What is on people's minds during that holiday would have been kind of a neat insight to have, and another layer to this. But I think that speaks to the power of how we typically use it when we're doing rebrands. We often have anywhere from 3 to 20 stakeholders on a project. And as you know, like getting 20 people to agree on brand colors is just a painful exercise because it's a lot of opinions, a lot of opinions held strongly sometimes. But this is a way where you can come together, you can put together a series of APMs with those 20 people where they all get to have a say. They think it should look like this. Somebody else thinks it should look like that. And they might have very good reasons to believe that. And you put it all together and then you run the test and you see what really, out of the collections that you feel good about, which ones are really resonating, which ones are really going to perform. And then you have your answer, you know what to go with. So it's a really powerful collaboration tool as well.
I think that leads into like what we're doing with our next test. This one, I think you and I probably should have collaborated more about curating it, but we just didn't think to. But with our next test that we're running with Jake, who's an AI expert about intelligence, we are asking our audience to submit images. So we are asking like what other people think this looks like before we even run the test.
Yeah, this is something we haven't done before, and I'm really excited to see kind of how it goes. But we're reaching out to our audience, telling them about the test. So if you're watching this video right now, please add some comments with images. But we want to ask Jake's audience, Jake Van Cleef, he's an expert and an author in artificial intelligence. What does intelligence look like? And rather than me or you jumping on Pinterest or wherever to find images that we think are appropriate, we're asking the audience to provide images that they feel represent this concept of intelligence. And that should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so hopefully we get good results from that we can use.
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
I don't have any more questions specifically about this test. Is there anything that you want to conclude about this?
No, it was a lot of fun to do over the holiday. I get excited every time we run these. You know, hit refresh to see how many respondents we get as they're going there. So it was nice to see we were able to get about 50 people. Let's just look at the report here at the top. Yeah, 48 submissions for where we're at right now, just a few weeks into kind of publicly launching. I was really happy about that, and it's kind of cool. We've done this with thousands of responses for more commercial purposes, and I know that we'll get there. But just even looking at the dot patterns in the heat maps. It's you can do a lot with 50. You can really see, even that small of a sample set, some real conclusive patterns that you can feel confident about leaning in on. And
Yeah, like
I think
the,
it,
sorry, the image with MLK is basically other than one dot is all green, and then the lettering with the L and the red is like all red, which
yeah,
was really interesting. Like everybody unanimously like agreed without even speaking to each other.
right. And there's just no way to predict that, as far as I can tell, right? I mean, we put it out there. I had no idea, but very, very strong associations and agreement on certain swatches, positive and negative, and then others are a mix. And even those mixes are kind of interesting. Even the proximity of the dots, I think it's worth noting the swatch with Martin Luther King, there's one negative dot, but it's not on the image of the person. It's kind of off to the side on this text, which is a little aestheticized. I mean, it could be arguably a little bit commercial looking. And so these dot maps are really important. It's not just the readout at the end where we compile the positive and the negative. Sometimes looking at individual swatches and where dots are placed can give you some insight as well.
And I'm excited to even like the holidays coming up to see what tests we could run with all those throughout the year too.
Yeah, we'll definitely be doing these fun ones for every holiday. I think Halloween's the next one on our list there, and that should be a lot of fun to curate, and we'll do that one together and kind of see what comes out of it.